We're now joined by Brendan Marks of The Athletic, covers both Duke and North Carolina. Brendan, thanks so much for coming on today. How's it going?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you guys having me. It's my favorite time of year, busiest time of year, but my favorite.
Busy time of year, to say the least, especially for the Blue Devils. A 4-point win over Notre Dame last night, earlier in the week, in terms of when we're posting this, but a big game coming up this weekend inside the Dome against Syracuse. But you look at the Duke season as a whole, Brendan, and from our vantage point, at least, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems like underachieving is a word that comes to mind, especially when you look at the Duke teams from the past few years. And obviously things are different and maybe a less talented roster and a new coach, but just how much is there a vibe around Durham right now that this team is kind of nowhere near where it should in terms of tapping into its potential?
Yeah, I think you look at the recruiting class that Jon Scheyer brought in, obviously the number one recruiting class in the country this year. And with that, there are expectations, as there are every year in Durham, and you go and you look at the past couple of years when Duke has brought in, these number one classes, these number one overall player types. Makes you think of Paolo Banchero, makes you think of Jason Tatum, Marvin Bagley, some of the best players, that we see in the NBA now, but who have come through Durham. And the fact of the matter is this year's recruiting class was not built the same way. It is number one in the country, but not all 5 stars are created equal. And Duke learned that a couple of years ago during the COVID season when they missed the tournament altogether. But this team certainly is in a similar boat, I would say. Duke is improving. I think that is certainly something you can say. They are getting better game by game, but for a variety of reasons, injuries, illnesses, inconsistency, they definitely have not reached their potential yet this season. I think the good news, if you're a Duke fan, and the optimism that is here locally, is rooted in the fact that there is still another 3 weeks of the season. You are still continuing to get better. And at least at this point in the season, Duke is positioned fairly well to make the NCAA tournament. So you do have a little bit longer of a runway.
What would you say from a production standpoint and of the roster makeup has been the biggest surprise on the team, but also the biggest disappointment? Little two-parter there.
Yeah. So I don't know, how closely people follow, the roster machinations every year, but there are only 2 players back on Duke's roster from the Final Four team last year, and only one of them actually played, Jeremy Roach, who is the junior captain of the team. There's 11 other new guys, 7 freshmen, one of whom are reclassified. So it's an incredibly, incredibly young team. So from a production standpoint, I would say the thing that has been probably most surprising and disappointing, it's sort of the same. You look at the top 2 recruits in the class, Derek Lively and Dariq Whitehead. And, that was sort of something I alluded to earlier. These guys have both dealt with injuries and illnesses and now inconsistency. So, I think Whitehead has probably been the bigger surprise, just because he came in with a little bit of a higher ceiling. He was sort of projected as a lottery pick, everything that an NBA team could want in a scoring wing, had all the defensive chops that you wanted. And unfortunately, back in August, he breaks his foot, comes back, then he gets sick, comes back, then he hurts his other leg. Now he's finally back again. And while you have seen that production rise when he's playing, it hasn't been with any sort of consistency. Derek Lively, on the other hand, came in as the quote unquote number one overall prospect in the class. And again, when you hear that, you think of Paolo, you think of Tatum, you think of these elite guys, and he is just not that guy. Has never been that guy, has never been a scoring focused player. His value comes on the defensive end as a rebounder and as a passer. And, frankly, that's just not as sexy as a guy who can go and put up 30 points a game. And Derek Lively is not that. He's not going to put up 30 points a game. I don't know that he'll ever be that kind of player. But again, he's a guy who injured his calf in the preseason, comes back, then gets sick, then comes back, dealt with a small knee injury, comes back. So there's been some roster incontinuity, guys in and out and shuffling around. But those 2 guys had the highest ceiling come into this year. And I think because of various reasons, we haven't quite seen them hit those ceilings yet.
We spent some time on the podcast earlier talking about Duke's sort of struggles offensively. Again, if you want to call it struggles, Kyle Filipowski, the only guy that's over 15 points per game on the year, and he barely even is. what would you say have been, I mean, you mentioned obviously some of the expectations falling flat as far as individuals, but from more of a team overall broad standpoint, what have been some of the areas in terms of putting the ball in the hoop where the Blue Devils have just kind of fell flat this year?
Yeah, well, Duke looks a lot like me when I go to play pickup basketball, and that the fact that they can't make jump shots. Duke right now this season, I believe they're not even at 33% from three. They're at 32.3% on the year, outside of the top 250 in the nation. That's a big reason. If you can't make jump shots, there's only so much you can do. And so essentially Duke's offensive style has had to be reshaped on the form, if you want to call it. And on the fly, what they have turned into is a team that just outsizes you. This is one of the biggest teams in the country. They start multiple guys, only one guy in the team who starts is not 6'5". So they start someone who's 6'5", someone who's 6'9". They start 2 7-footers and Kyle Filipowski and Derek Lively. So the length is certainly there. And actually, per KenPom, they're the biggest team in the country in terms of average height. And because of that, what they do is they just kill you inside. They get Filipowski inside. They get graduate transfer Ryan Young from Northwestern inside. They get Derek Lively inside. They get guys in the paint. And occasionally, when they are able to kick out and actually hit open threes, as they did at the end of the Notre Dame game earlier this week, that's when you start to see them sort of at their offensive best. But that hasn't been with any sort of consistency. And again, Dariq Whitehead has been their best three-point shooter on the season, and he's missed, now 7, 8, 9 games. So when you're missing your best three-point shooter on a team that already struggles there, you're kind of behind the 8 ball offensively.
When you look at coaching on this team, it's Jon Scheyer's first year at the helm. He was announced that he was going to be Coach K's successor before last season. So he's had some time to prepare for this. How would you describe the differences, covering this team a lot, between watching Coach K coach a team and watching Jon Scheyer operate this season?
Yeah, certainly there are differences, big ones, especially in terms of demeanor. I would say that Jon, on the whole, is probably more optimistic and more confidence instilling than Coach K may have been at times. It's just a little bit less of that drill sergeant mentality that K had. And in terms of X's and O's, listen, like Jon has changed some things up. The last couple of years under K, there's been criticisms, broadly from the college basketball world. You can ask NBA teams, you can ask agents, you can ask scouts, whoever, recruits. And there was this sentiment that Duke didn't really have to do a whole lot more than just roll the balls out. And because they had that level of talent, that was capable and that worked. Jon, I think, has certainly toyed with some different sets. You've seen Duke run a lot more open sets this year, so a lot more 5-out stuff than they had done in the past. Transition game is something that's been a little bit more of an emphasis. They play defensively. Some of their ball screen coverages have been different. Some of the things they want to do that way. Duke was always a heavy on-ball pressure team under K. You haven't necessarily seen that, and therefore you don't see the turnover numbers that maybe we were used to under Coach K-led teams. So there are clear X's and O's difference, but I think the big thing is like Jon is still just learning what his style is. Like, he hasn't gotten a tee this season, for example. And I think there have been a couple of times when he's gotten close and you're sort of wondering, okay, is he going to step over the line? Like, is he going to get to that point? And he hasn't yet. Whereas you can totally imagine Coach K in those same situations, he'd gotten teed up 3-4 times by now. So that has been a difference. And, even you look at the end of that controversial Duke-Virginia game last week, at the end of that game, I firmly believe if Coach K is still coaching Duke at that time, he is not letting his team go to overtime without getting an explanation of what the call is. Maybe not agreeing with it, maybe throwing a fight, but he at least is going to get some clarification about, okay, this is the reason why. And Jon didn't get that. Neither did Tony Bennett, but Jon didn't get that. And so I think that's another, specific example of how he's learning on the fly. But, he is certainly trying to do some things his own way. He's brought in guys from outside of the Duke sphere, outside of the Duke bubble. And, it hasn't worked perfectly, but I really compliment him and applaud him for trying some different stuff.
From an outsider's perspective, what would you sort of say the vibe is surrounding Scheyer? I mean, obviously it's tough to garner more respect than someone like Coach K has done over the past couple of decades, but when it comes to Scheyer, What sort of the other teams around the league? What is their opinion? What is their scouting report on him so far in terms of, commanding not the same level of respect, obviously, but recognizing that, okay, look, this guy is a legit successor. He knows what he's doing. He's got the right idea.
Yeah, well, I think people, especially the ones who've been in the league for a little bit longer time, the Leonard Hamiltons, the Jim Larenegas, the Mike Brays, the Boeheims, they have seen Jon when he was a player, so they know how smart he is, they know how capable he is. And that is the biggest thing. I think a lot of people, during the whole succession plan, they looked at Jon and it was like, okay, he was the guy in the right spot at the right time. That is not at all the reason that Jon Scheyer is the coach at Duke right now. Certainly, he benefited from being at Duke when he was. He benefited from having the experience of being around K this last decade and having sort of learned the way the program operates on a really granular level. But this dude is an incredibly, incredibly smart basketball mind. I don't know how many people, outside of the Duke bubble are aware of this, but when Jon's playing career finished at Duke and he goes to the NBA, he's in summer league. Jon was supposed to be like the backup point guard for the LeBron James, Dwayne Wade Heat teams. And he goes into summer league and Joe Ingles pokes his eye out, damages his eye irreparably. And that's the end of his career. That's the only reason Jon Scheyer never really got a shot at an NBA career. I mean, so this guy has the basketball IQ 100%. And you hear that around the league. Some of the, it's big things in terms of scouting and responsibilities. He's implemented a system that Duke hadn't had the past couple of years where he is a true offensive defensive coordinator. You've also seen it in a more game-to-game level, being aware of specific in-game situations. Duke's been really good this year at 2-for-1s at the end of halves, at the end of games. Those are all things that he drills in. And this dude is basically like, he's a basketball junkie. And Tony Bennett has said that this year. Jim Larenega has said that. Hubert Davis has said that. Some of the best coaches in the league have sort of referred to him in that light. And if you ask around, not just in the ACC, but the whole country, Jon is seen as one of those coaches who has the potential over the next 2 decades to really be one of the faces of college basketball. He's got serious staying power at Duke.
How does he use that knowledge in recruiting? Because you look at Duke's recruiting classes over the past, half decade, half dozen years, whatever, and it is top 10 every single season. This past year, number 1 overall, like we were talking about. How is he such a good recruiter and already continuing to build for the future, even if the results on the court aren't as good as Duke fans may hope?
Yeah, well, I think he has benefited in that the time he has been back, Duke won national championship in 2015 when he was on staff, made it back to the Final Four last year when he was on staff. And listen, like, it's not just him, so there is some on-court success, but you're selling Duke, you're selling all of the perks that come with that. You're selling the NBA experience. You're selling the access to NBA teams and players and personnel. You're selling the basically professional development system that you're coming into. You're selling the NIL opportunities, which Duke has, at a national level. But the thing that makes him such a good recruiter specifically is the fact that he is just a really good relationships dude. He is somebody who is constantly calling guys, constantly on the phone. I did a feature on him earlier this year and was asking him just like, how do you manage your time? Because he's the father of 3 too. He's a newborn who was born over the summer. Like, how do you manage your time? He's like, I'm up every day at 5. I sleep 6 hours. Sometimes I sleep 4 hours. And the first thing I do every morning is I catch up on all the scores around the league. I call our guys if they had a good game. I talk to my counterparts in Europe who I, call for basketball advice. Like, the dude is just incredibly well connected and he really values those relationships. Even with reporters, like, if my mom is sick and I miss a game, the next time I see him, he's going to ask how my mom's doing. So it's little things like that. And it carries over and recruits really value that. So he obviously is selling a great product. But also I think he's, a really good salesman at doing so.
In terms of getting back to the X's and O's on the court a little bit, we spent some time earlier talking about some of the individual players. But Brendan, if you could say maybe one player that you think is the X factor in terms of this team going on a run down the stretch that maybe hasn't quite figured it out yet, but could kind of be that lethal weapon for Scheyer and company to have in their back pocket, who is that guy for you?
Yeah, I don't actually think it's very close. It's Dariq Whitehead. This guy comes in, he's a top 5 national recruit. He's 6'7", he's muscled up. Everybody in the country wants him. And yes, he's had some injuries. Yes, he's had some inconsistency, but you're talking about a guy who in his first game back comes in against Virginia last week and goes on a personal 10-0 scoring run. You're talking about a guy who is now 40% from 3 over the season and is Duke's clear-cut best 3-point shooter. And as I mentioned, that's the dynamic this offense has been missing. I don't even think that we've seen the best from him in terms of slashing and creating. That was his reputation in high school. It was like, he's going to get the ball in the perimeter, he's going to drive in, and he's going to yam it all over your face. So I think that he is really the guy, and especially, specifically in this matchup against Syracuse, he's the guy who, okay, if you're going to have open jump shots against the zone, he's the guy who's going to have those. That's where Duke's going to funnel the ball. That's the guy they want knocking down threes. And if he can do that, both in this game and moving forward, then I do think that it changes the level of Duke's ceiling. I think it raises it.
You talked a lot about Whitehead, but the two guys that I've been reading more about would be Kyle Filipowski. Jeremy Roach read your piece yesterday where he pulled a lot of the ACC on The Athletic. And it seems like Filipowski is the clear-cut choice for someone that's the best freshman in the ACC. I think people in Syracuse want to make the argument for Judah Mintz with the season he's having. But if you look at the overall spectrum of things, I think Filipowski takes that crown. That's someone Syracuse recruited hard over the summer, and then Duke comes in and says, we'll take him. Thank you very much. Well, how has he been so good this season? And then if you could touch on Roach as well, just as the leader and one of only 2 returners as well, it feels like watching that North Carolina game a couple of weeks ago, down the stretch, he was doing everything, had that game clinching layup. How have those 2 guys really motored this team throughout the entire season?
Yeah, absolutely. I know Syracuse fans have got to be sick seeing what Kyle Filipowski's done this year, because he was going there. It was that close. And like you said, Duke swoops in. But listen, he's a 7-foot stretch 4. So if you're a team who's trying to defend him, you basically got 2 choices. Do I want to put a quicker guy on him who can hang with him, who might not be as tall, and let Kyle get inside? Or do I want to put a bigger guy in him to disincentivize him from trying to, drive to the lane or try to post up? But then maybe he's going to, bang a couple of threes on my head. Which one do you prefer? Pick your poison. And that has sort of been his thing. He's incredibly skilled for a 7-footer. I mean, he can Euro step. He's got spin moves. Like his control and his handle and his skill level is just super high for somebody who's that big. And yeah, I think he is a legit all ACC first team guy. I think he's been that good. He's a first round pick. If he leaves after this season, he's been the biggest mismatch that Duke has this year. And, I think that, he and Mintz are probably the 2 guys at this point. I probably wouldn't have expected those to be the 2 guys before the season started, but it's hard to make an argument they're not the 2 best freshmen in the league. And then Jeremy Roach, yeah, listen, one thing that Duke has done with him recently, and I'll be interested to see what this looks like against Syracuse, is last year he was a true point guard on this team. Like you had Paolo Banchero, you had Wendell Moore, you had Mark Williams, you had all these nice complementary pieces, AJ Griffin. And Jeremy Roach was kind of the head of the snake. He made everything go. This year, especially lately in the last month and a half or so, what Duke has done is they've shifted him off ball. And Tyrese Proctor is the point guard now, and they've freed Roach up as a scoring guard. And the reason for that is because his pick and roll efficiency numbers were horrendous. He was one of the least efficient pick and roll scorers in the league and in the country. And 2, his catch and shoot numbers are really good. His ISO numbers are really good. His cutting numbers are really good. His transition numbers. So by doing that, they have freed him up to be much more attack focused. He doesn't have to worry about setting guys up. And as a result, you've seen his scoring average rise. So yeah, against Syracuse, I mean, those are probably the 3 guys, Whitehead, Roach, and Filipowski, who are going to be taking the majority of the perimeter shots. And, I don't think that it's unfair to say that those 3 and their consistency the last, month of the season or so is going to depend, it's going to determine basically where Duke ends up going in the postseason.
Want to shift gears a little bit here because it's no secret. Syracuse fans know this well, that when, the schedule comes out every year, the Duke game is a circle it on your calendar type game, a must watch, a must be at type game. From a Duke standpoint, look, it's no secret. Nobody's Carolina. But my question is, after Carolina, like, where does Syracuse fall in terms of the hierarchy of games that Duke fans get up for? I don't, some Cuse fans like to use the word rivalry. Be the bearer of bad news for us here, Brendan. Is it a one-way rivalry?
Yeah, I to use that meme, we don't even think about you. I don't even know who you are. It is really that dynamic. Like there is not when the schedule comes out, I don't know that there is a single Duke player or fan outside of like regionally in the Northeast who goes, "Oh man, that Syracuse game, that's what I gotta watch." Um, I don't think any Duke fan thinks that because look, obviously you've got Carolina. That is I think it's the best rivalry in the country. The Duke Virginia rivalry is really strong, especially has been in the last decade or so. Especially as Tony has sort of brought Virginia to prominence. Those games have been really really good. Virginia Tech and Duke have had some really contentious games lately. Duke and Miami's kind of had Duke's number the last couple of years. I just don't know that Syracuse has been there. I don't know that Syracuse has fielded the caliber of team that makes Duke fans really think too strongly about them, to say it in the nicest possible way. But I do think, and I also will say this, I think the K Boeheim dynamic certainly enhanced it. And I do think that now that it is Scheyer and he doesn't have that tie, I don't know that it is nearly as strong. So now could that change? Could we have some Blazers pulled off? Absolutely, we could. But I just think that the last couple of years, the way that the games have gone, the disparity between the teams has sort of lessened it. And I certainly would not use the word rivalry. And I think that a lot of folks down here would agree with me in that respect.
Right. I was going to say it feels like it was only built up because of the relationship between Boeheim and K. And now that K isn't there, that connection, as you said, is gone. Sticking with the theme of these two teams, Duke's only won 2 true road games all season. Boston College and Georgia Tech. I don't think you'd call those the strongest road wins in the world. Is that a cause for concern coming up to the JMA Dome where Syracuse has played pretty well all season?
It absolutely is a concern, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but Duke splits in terms of shooting the ball at home and away are truly Jekyll and Hyde-esque. Like it is 2 completely different teams. Duke is one of the few teams in the country that's still undefeated at home this year. The Cameron advantage is real. And on the road, that hasn't been the case. This is a team that largely has struggled on the road. And, obviously everybody saw what happened at Virginia. I think that, the ACC came out and said that Duke probably should have been awarded some free throws there at the end of the game to win that one. And obviously we're talking differently about their road woes if that one goes differently. But yeah, this is certainly a concern. So like you mentioned, Syracuse has played well at the Dome. And listen, I do think that the zone is something that's been a challenge for Duke at times because this is not, like I've said, not a good shooting team. So certainly I think Syracuse fans may be offended if I say this. I think Duke fans are largely looking at this game as almost like a trap game of sorts because Duke is still seeing itself as being in position to take a top 4 seed in the ACC tournament, to be playing on Thursday, and obviously losing to Syracuse would do a lot to damage those hopes. That, I believe, is how they are approaching this game. But certainly the fact that this game was on the road is a concern.
All right. So when it comes to Saturday, Brendan, what's one thing specifically that you'll be keying in on as far as a key to the matchup for the Blue Devils to make sure they do take care of business and don't fall victim? And then I don't know if you've made an official prediction yet, but maybe we could trouble you for one and see how you have this one going down come Saturday.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I'm really interested to see is what Duke is going to give up some threes. It happens. They give them up. It's how they play. The one thing that Duke specifically has really predicated on all season has been defense, specifically interior defense. Derek Lively is key to that. You've seen him come on the last month or so, and be it against opposing guards trying to drive in, be it against bigs trying to post up, he has the length and athleticism to really bother them. So I'm really interested to see what Syracuse looks like offensively when they maybe don't have those drives inside. What is Judah Mintz's value if you're not allowing him to get to the rim? So that's one thing that I'm looking for. As far as a prediction, I haven't made one officially, but if I had to, I would say that I think probably I would go with Duke. But I do think it's going to be a really close game. I think it's going to be a game that's decided in the last couple of minutes. As we have talked about, Duke doesn't have that, top end talent to where they put it into hyperdrive and just sort of kick out a 12-point lead and cruise from there. I think it's going to be a game that's really decided on some late shot making. And while that's been an area Duke has struggled in, I think getting Whitehead back, I think this could be really a signature game for him. This could be like a true breakout, which of course would be like Syracuse's worst nightmare. But I think that he's the guy who's the difference. I think he'll be able to make some shots, and ultimately, I think that'll be the difference in a Duke win.
Well, we'll certainly find out on Saturday. It's Syracuse and Duke coming up at 6 p.m. this Saturday from the Dome. That's Brendan Marks of The Athletic covering Duke and Carolina. Be sure to give him a follow on Twitter at Brendan R. Marks, doing some great work over with The Athletic. Brendan, thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.